And now, for the second part of our discussion, we're going to talk about the presence of the different basic cell types. Now, whenever we're talking about the different cell types, we're actually going to have a short trip down the memory lane with your discussions once again in Science 7, which involves the discussions that you had regarding the presence of the prokaryotic cells and even of the eukaryotic cells. Now, let's simply start with the most basic type of cell, and that is known as the prokaryotic cell. Prokaryotic cells, it is present on the organisms known as prokaryotes. Prokaryotic came from two words, pro, which means before, and karyote, which simply means kernel, or this kernel represents now the nucleus. From the name itself, prokaryotic, which simply means before kernel or before nucleus. Prokaryotic cells, these are the different types of cells that do not possess any nucleus at all, but rather, in the place of the nucleus, the DNA that is present in these organisms are located at the center of the cell, which is on an unbound region called the nucleoid. If you're going to observe your module, specifically on page number 7 of your module, you're going to see there that the reason why the prokaryotic cells gradually became eukaryotic cells, it is because of the presence of the enfolding process of the plasma membrane that is present on early prokaryotic cells. Other than the fact that prokaryotic cells are generally very tiny and they can occupy a very small space, these prokaryotic cells, they do not actually possess membrane-bound organelles. And at the same time, the cytosol bound by the plasma membrane. Prokaryotic cells are considered to be as the oldest type of cells that simply roamed around the earth. Prokaryotic cells are generally found on bodies of water, probably around 3.5 billion years ago. And in the case of these prokaryotic cells, once again, they are very simple. Then after some time, because of the course of evolution, eukaryotic cells arrived. Eukaryotic cells from, once again, two words, eu, which means true, then karyote, which simply means kernel or nucleus. Eukaryotic cells are present among eukaryotes, or the organisms possessing true nucleus, in which the DNA is present in the nucleus that is bounded by a membranous nuclear envelope. Then, if you're going to observe on page number 7 of your module, you're going to observe here the process on how eukaryotic cells were created from the primitive prokaryotic cells by means of the process known as enfolding, or the folding of the different membranous part of the plasma membrane towards the interior of the cell, enveloping now the DNA or the genetic material that is present in these prototype cells. Then at the same time, other than the presence of the membranous nuclear envelope, because of the presence of this enfolding, different membrane-bound organelles were also created, which involves the presence of the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, and even the presence of some vacuoles and even lysosomes. Eukaryotic cells are possessing the cytoplasm that is in the region between the cell membrane and the nucleus. Remember, in the case of prokaryotic cells, the plasma membrane is the one that is guarding the cytosol, and the nucleoid is just floating in between the plasma membrane and the cytosol. In the case of the eukaryotic cell, there is now the presence of what we know as the cytoplasm, since there are actually different types of organelles that are now present in these particular cells. Then, as mentioned earlier, it is now in between the cell membrane and the nucleus. So, do not actually be somewhat skeptic when it comes to the term cell membrane and plasma membrane. Plasma membrane is the general term that we are using for the different membranes that is present on all cells. While, if we are considering now the presence of eukaryotic cells, we are usually using the term cell membrane, because cell membrane is usually used in the presence of both animal cells and plant cells. So once again, plasma membrane is the general term, while cell membrane is usually used whenever we are talking about the eukaryotic cells. Also, eukaryotic cells are generally much larger than prokaryotic cells, and they are actually occupying a lot of space compared with prokaryotic cells. What are the different things that you should remember when it comes to the different organisms possessing these different types of cells? Well, once again, I'm going to provide the PowerPoint presentation for this since there are different parts of our video that will simply be covered by my video when I am discussing this part. There are actually different classifications based on the different characteristics that is present on different life forms on Earth. We're actually considering three main domains, and those domains are the following: domain bacteria, domain archaea, and domain eukarya. Both domain bacteria and domain archaea are actually possessing prokaryotic cells, while domain eukarya, it is the only domain that is consisting of different organisms that is possessing eukaryotic cells. And now let's consider the different organisms that are possessing prokaryotic cells. The different prokaryotic organisms are actually included in the domain known as the domain archaea and the domain bacteria. Whenever we're talking about the domains, this is the major classification of all life forms on Earth. Okay, and now let's simply discuss every single one of them. Starting off with domain archaea. Domain archaea, these are the different organisms that are known for living in extreme environments. And you can actually observe here that in the case of these archaeans, they're actually very simple. They possess different types of adaptations which permits them to survive in different extreme and harsh environments. For instance, we have here the presence of the kingdom Archachacteria. This is the only kingdom that is present on the domain archaea. If you can recall, on your discussion probably on Science 8 and on Science 10, remember that whenever we are talking about the hierarchy of organisms, we are naming them based on the mnemonic. Thus, King Philip came over for a good soup. Now, we are going to start with the discussion regarding domain, which is for letter D, then kingdom, then phylum, class, order, family, genus, specific epithet, and then the scientific name. So those are actually the different hierarchy of organization that we are going to consider when we are going to discuss systematics. But we're not going to be very specific when it comes to that part. Let's have this discussion one step at a time. Some of the representatives of kingdom Archachacteria are the different organisms possessing now different adaptations which permit them to live in extreme environments, just like the thermoacidophiles, which are present on hot springs. From the name itself, thermoacidophiles, these are the different organisms which loves extremely high temperature and extremely acidic waters. Then, we also have the presence of the methanogens, which are now present on the sewage because they thrive on the presence of methane, and these organisms die with the presence of oxygen. Then, at the same time, there are also different types of archaeans, which are considered as halophiles, which are present on conditions possessing very high amount of salt, just like the presence of the Great Salt Lakes and the Dead Sea. Let's now proceed to the domain bacteria. Domain bacteria, it is considered as one of the largest groups on Earth because a lot of the surfaces on Earth is actually possessing different types of bacteria. Remember, bacteria, it is the plural form, while bacterium is the singular form. Even on my face at this very moment, on your cell phones, on your laptop, even on your books, even on your hands, even if you sanitize, there's a possibility that at least 0.01% of bacteria will still be evident on the different surfaces on Earth. If we're going to consider this, the domain bacteria is considered as not only the largest by means of the different classifications, but also the largest by means of their population. They are also classified by the shape, the need for oxygen, and the diseases they cause. And lastly, they are possessing an extra layer of protection known as the peptidoglycan. The difference between archaeans and bacteria, it is the presence of the substance known as peptidoglycan. And if you're going to consider the name itself, the name peptidoglycan, or what are the different words that will simply resonate to every single one of you? Peptido, which simply means the presence of peptides, or it is related to proteins. Then glycan, which is now related to glucose. Peptidoglycan is an extra layer that is made out of proteins and glucose compounds. And this peptidoglycan is responsible now for the different adaptation that is happening on the different types of bacteria that is on Earth. The only kingdom that is present in the domain bacteria, it is known as the kingdom Eubacteria. Some of the examples that we have here the presence of the Streptococcus pneumoniae, bacteria that is responsible for the presence of pneumonia, and the other one we have here the presence of a cyanobacteria. The cyanobacteria, which is the reason why oxygen is now present on the surface and in the atmosphere of the Earth. Whenever we are naming the different bacteria that is present around us, the first type of classification when it comes to their naming, it is actually based on their shape. We can observe here that bacteria are actually possessing different types of shapes based on their group, based on their characteristics, and at the same time based on their environment. We have here the presence of the spherical shaped bacteria, we have here the presence of rod-shaped bacteria, and we have here the presence of spiral-shaped bacteria, which are named as the following. The first one, for the spherical type of bacteria, they are known as the Coccus group, or the plural which is known as cocci. For instance, Streptococcus pneumoniae. You could observe here that this is circular. The reason why, from the name itself, Streptococcus, coccus which simply means circular. Then, in the case of the term strepto, which simply means they are in a cluster. Then, the second classification, we have here the presence of the rod-shaped bacteria known as the bacillus or the bacilli. The bacillus, from the term itself, they actually resembles rods, or just like Cheetos. They even resembles the shape of hot dogs, and even the shape of sausage, and even the shape of tampons. So that is actually the shape of the bacillus or the bacilli. Basic example, for instance, Lactobacillus casei shirota strain. The bacteria that is present on Yakult, the present on yogurt drinks that you usually consume. From the name itself, Lactobacillus. Lacto, which simply means it is present on milk, just like in our discussion on Module 2. Then, Bacillus, because those cells, they are possessing rod-shaped structures. And lastly, we have the presence of the spiral-shaped bacteria known as the Spirillus or the Spirilli. The different species of Eubacteria may be grouped based on staining. And if you're going to pursue higher biology, specifically when you go to health and allied courses, when you go to college, you're going to consider here the discussions regarding biotechnology and even microbiology. Whenever we are talking about staining, there is actually a type of stain known as gram staining. That is a process of staining different types of materials for us to determine if they are gram-negative or gram-positive microorganisms. Now, in the case of gram-negative bacteria, they are possessing thin layer of peptidoglycan. Then, their stain, after the process of gram stain, they will be equivalent to color pink. And they are now possessing endotoxins. The gram-negative bacteria, from the name itself, endotoxins, they are possessing different types of toxins that is present in the interior of the cell. Or, for instance, if we're going to consume this particular type of bacteria, there's a possibility that once they interacted with our digestive juices, it will now release the toxins that is present inside those microorganisms. Unlike in the case of gram-positive bacteria. Gram-positive bacteria, they are now possessing thicker layer of peptidoglycan. Then they are possessing purple stain. And lastly, they are possessing exotoxins, or these bacteria are releasing different types of toxins once they die. Okay? In the case of endotoxins, once again, they are present in the interior of those cells, while in the case of the exotoxins, they are simply being released once these microorganisms die. Now, when it comes to gram staining, what is the reason why gram-negative bacteria will be stained pink while gram-positive bacteria will be stained purple? Gram-positive bacteria will be stained color purple because of the presence of the dye known as crystal violet. Crystal violet is the dye that is being used to stain color violet or color purple when it comes to gram-positive bacteria. While in the case of the gram-negative bacteria, they are actually using here the safranin. The color safranin, which is color red, in which once it interacted with other dyes and other materials that will be involved in the gram staining process, it created the color pink pigment. Because the red stain will not actually stay, but rather it will just retain the remnant color pink. Once again, gram-positive, it is because of the presence of crystal violet, and in the case of gram-negative, it is the presence of safranin. Those are the different dyes that are being used when it comes to gram staining. Eukaryotic organisms are all under the domain known as domain Eukarya. And this domain is actually divided into different kingdoms known as Kingdom Protista, Kingdom Fungi or Fungi, Kingdom Plantae, and the Kingdom Animalia. But we're not going to focus on this particular discussion. Once again, this is reserved on future discussions about this. I would like just to introduce these concepts to every single one of you since we are talking about the presence of the different types of cells. There is a proper avenue in which we are going to discuss this, different prokaryotic and eukaryotic organisms, when we already discussed here the different mechanisms that is involved on every single one of them.